Richard Lawson sat huddled on the cold concrete, his fingers clutching the cardboard sign that read, "Need help." The city buzzed around him, cars honking, people rushing to and from their daily routines, their faces a blur of indifference. The sharp winter wind cut through his tattered jacket, sending a shiver down his spine. His hair, once meticulously combed, now hung in dirty, matted strands around his face. The lines of his age were deepened by years of hardship, and his eyes, once confident and sharp, now appeared hollow, as if he had seen too much and felt too little. He had once been a man who walked with purpose, a man whose every decision was made with precision, whose handshakes meant something. He had once owned a thriving business, surrounded by luxury and power. But those days were gone. Now, he was just another face in the crowd, invisible to the world around him. A failure. The sound of footsteps approached, and Richard didn't bother looking up. He had long since grown accustomed to being ignored. The occasional passerby would glance at him briefly, their eyes flicking away almost instantly, as if they feared catching his gaze. He understood it. People didn't want to see him. They didn't want to acknowledge the fall of someone who had once been at the top. But today, something was different. A shadow fell over him, blocking the sun's weak afternoon rays. Richard looked up, surprised. Standing before him was a woman, young, in her late 20s perhaps, with kind eyes and a gentle expression. Her brown hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and her worn jacket suggested she had her own struggles. But there was something in the way she held herself, open, unguarded, that caught Richard off guard. She didn't look at him with pity. She didn't look at him as if he were a stain on the sidewalk. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a forced, awkward smile like most people gave. It was a warm, genuine smile that made Richard pause for a moment longer than he intended. It made him feel seen. "Hi," she said, her voice soft yet steady, as if she had done this before. "I have some food here if you like something." Richard's first instinct was to refuse, to keep up his hardened exterior. But the smile on her face, the warmth in her eyes, made him pause. She wasn't treating him like a charity case. She wasn't offering him a handout with the subtle air of superiority that so many others did. She simply offered him a meal, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "No thanks," Richard muttered, his voice hoarse from a lack of use. "I'm fine." She didn't take offense, though. Instead, she crouched down in front of him, her hands gently placing a paper bag of food between them. "I'm Olivia," she said, her voice still calm, almost as if she were talking to an old friend. "I work nearby. I see you here sometimes, and I thought you might be hungry." Richard studied her for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Her eyes were not filled with pity, but with something else, a kind of compassion that seemed so rare in a world that had turned its back on him. She wasn't here to save him, or to offer him false promises. She was simply offering her humanity. For a moment, Richard felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. "I don't need charity," he said, his voice edged with bitterness. "I didn't think you did," Olivia replied, her tone light, not defensive, just matter of fact. "I just thought you might appreciate a meal. A moment of kindness. No strings attached." Her words hung in the air for a second, and Richard felt a strange tug in his chest. He was used to the pity, the avoidance, the whispered conversations behind his back. But this was different. It felt real. For a brief second, he thought about brushing her off, but something in her presence made him want to stay in the moment. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, not as a beggar, but as a person. Maybe it was the kindness in her tone, the sincerity that radiated from her in such a simple, yet powerful way. "Why would you want to help me?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost to himself. It wasn't an accusation, just a question that had been bouncing around in his head ever since he'd fallen from grace. Why would anyone want to help someone like him? Olivia sat down beside him, pulling her knees up to her chest. She didn't seem uncomfortable, despite the cold air and the rough surroundings. There was something about her calm presence that made Richard feel oddly at ease. "I guess it's just the right thing to do," Olivia said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like no one sees you. It's not much, but if I can make someone's day a little easier, even just for a few minutes, that's enough for me." Richard didn't know how to respond to that. He had spent so long building walls around himself, both physical and emotional, that the idea of simply being seen, being acknowledged as a person again, was foreign to him. For so long, he had pushed everyone away, convinced that he didn't need anyone. He had told himself that survival was all that mattered now. But as he looked at Olivia, a seed of doubt started to sprout. Maybe survival wasn't all there was. Maybe, just maybe, there could be something more. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together in the cold, the bustling city around them seeming to fade away as Richard took in the quiet warmth of Olivia's presence. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that kindness wasn't just an illusion, that it wasn't too late to be seen, to matter again. Finally, he picked up the bag of food. It was a small thing, but for Richard, it felt like the first step in a long journey. A journey he wasn't sure he was ready for, but one that he knew he couldn't ignore. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with something he hadn't expected: gratitude. Olivia simply smiled again, her eyes soft with understanding. "You're welcome, Richard." The days passed, and Richard found himself waiting for Olivia's visits more eagerly than he cared to admit. The city, once a blur of indifferent faces, had started to feel less lonely with her around. Her small acts of kindness, handing him a hot cup of coffee, offering him a sandwich, were more than simple gestures. They were moments that chipped away at the walls he had built so carefully around himself. Each day, Olivia appeared, her smile like a beacon of warmth in a cold world. The contrast between her lightheartedness and his despair was stark, but it wasn't as though she came to him out of pity. There was no charity in her actions, just an unwavering sense of compassion, a desire to ease someone's burden, if only for a few minutes. Richard tried to keep his distance at first. He had told himself that he didn't need anyone, especially not someone like Olivia, who still had her whole life ahead of her. What could she possibly understand about the pain he carried? The failure that weighed him down? Yet, somehow, each conversation they shared felt like a lifeline. She didn't push him to talk, but when he did open up, it was always in fits and starts, pieces of his past slipping out like fragments of a broken mirror. He spoke in fragments at first, afraid to confront the full scope of his downfall. But Olivia didn't interrupt or judge. She listened with an attentiveness that made Richard uncomfortable at first, as if she really wanted to know him, the real him, not the version he had become. "I used to have it all," Richard said one afternoon as they sat on the curb, the wind carrying the faint scent of nearby bakeries. "A wife, a company, my own damn empire." Olivia nodded, but didn't reply immediately. There was no rush to fill the silence. He hadn't realized how much he missed that, being able to just sit in the quiet with someone without needing to explain or fill the void with forced words. "I lost it all," he continued, his voice low, filled with a bitterness he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. "One bad decision, one person I trusted, and everything came crashing down." His fingers traced the rim of the coffee cup she had given him. He didn't look at her, but he could feel her presence, steady, unwavering. "I'm sorry," Olivia said quietly, breaking the silence, though her words didn't feel like empty sympathy. They felt real. "It must have been a hell of a fall." Richard gave a bitter laugh. Hell doesn't even begin to describe it. For a long moment, Olivia didn't speak. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the street, her eyes following the movement of pedestrians, her thoughts seemingly distant. Richard wondered if she could understand, even a fraction of it. After all, she had a life, a stable one, no doubt. Her job at the coffee shop was just enough to get by, and she didn't have the kind of legacy that came crashing down around you. But when Olivia spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with an honesty that surprised him. "You know, my dad, he's the one who built the family business. The empire, I guess you could call it. But he always made it clear that work came first. He didn't care if I was there or not, just as long as I could take care of the business. Every decision he made was about profit. That's how it always went." She paused. "I used to think if I could just prove myself to him, I'd matter. But the more I tried, the more he seemed to disappear." Richard glanced at her, finally meeting her gaze. Her eyes held a sadness he recognized, the same hollow look he had worn for years. She wasn't just talking about her father's neglect. She was talking about herself, about her own inner battle for recognition, for a place in the world. It was a loneliness he understood all too well. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," Richard said, the words leaving his mouth before he even thought about them. He wasn't sure why he said it, but it felt true. He'd spent so much of his life trying to prove his worth, through success, wealth, admiration. But now, sitting on the curb with Olivia, he realized how hollow all of that had been. Olivia looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if she were seeing him for the first time. "I'm not sure what else I've got left if I don't try," she replied softly. "But maybe you're right." Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of connection with her in that moment. She had her own scars, her own battles. And yet, there she was, offering him more understanding than anyone he had ever known. Maybe it wasn't just about surviving anymore. Maybe it was about finding meaning again, about connecting with someone who truly understood, who didn't look at him as a lost cause. "You've got more left than you think," Richard said, his voice steady now, the words coming easier than before. "I can see it in you." Olivia smiled faintly, her lips curving into a genuine, if weary, expression. "Thanks," she said. "I'm not sure I believe it yet, but it's nice to hear." From that day onward, their encounters became more than simple exchanges of food and pleasantries. They talked about everything: life, choices, regrets, dreams, opening up in ways neither of them had expected. Richard began to realize that Olivia's kindness wasn't just a random act of charity. It was a reflection of something deeper in her, a quiet resilience, a willingness to see people for who they were, not for what they had or hadn't done. Her ability to connect, even with someone like him, made him reconsider the walls he had built over the years. Maybe there was something left worth saving. Maybe he could still rebuild, in ways he hadn't even thought possible. One afternoon, as Richard finished another coffee Olivia had brought him, she handed him a small, crumpled envelope. He looked at it confused. "What's this?" "A letter," she said with a teasing smile. "I thought maybe it's time you sent something out into the world. Maybe it's a start." Richard hesitated, feeling a pang of uncertainty. A letter? What could he possibly write? But as he looked at Olivia's encouraging face, he felt something stir in him, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for the world to notice him and start reaching out again. He took the envelope from her, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was doing it for her or for himself. As the days turned into weeks, Richard found himself more and more drawn to Olivia's quiet presence. The steady rhythm of their encounters had become an anchor in his otherwise tumultuous life. No longer just an act of passing kindness, her visits had become the bright spots in his otherwise gray existence. He no longer felt invisible in her presence. She saw him, truly saw him, not as a beggar, not as a failure, but as a person. And that in itself felt like a small miracle. Olivia, too, had begun to look forward to their conversations. Each day, after her shift at the coffee shop, she would make the short walk to the corner where Richard sat. Sometimes she brought him food. Other times, it was simply a hot cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cold air, mingling with the scent of her lavender-scented hand lotion. Small acts, but they meant something to both of them. Her life, though simpler than Richard's past had been, had its own kind of complexity. She worked hard, sometimes juggling 2 jobs to make ends meet. And yet, she always seemed to carry an air of calm. That calmness, Richard realized, came not from a life free of struggle, but from her ability to find meaning in the small moments, to hold on to her sense of self despite the challenges she faced. She had a resilience he admired, one that he couldn't quite grasp anymore. It was on one of those chilly afternoons, as they sat side by side on the curb, sharing a brief, comfortable silence, that Olivia turned to him, her voice thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about you lately, Richard. And well, I think I've figured out why I keep coming back here." Richard raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. He had come to understand that Olivia's words always carried weight, as if each sentence she spoke was carefully chosen. She wasn't the type to speak without meaning, and it was that sincerity that made him feel so vulnerable. "Why?" he asked, unsure if he truly wanted to know the answer. But there was something in her eyes that made him trust her, and so he let the words fall out. Olivia smiled faintly, her gaze turning inward as though she were gathering her thoughts. I think it's because I see so much of myself in you. You know, I've spent years trying to be what others expected of me, trying to live up to this image of who I should be. But the truth is, I've been running away from the things that matter to me most, the things I really want. Richard blinked, surprised by her honesty. He hadn't expected this conversation to be about her. She had always seemed so put together, so certain of her path. But now, he realized that was just a facade she had built to protect herself. I guess we're both just trying to figure things out, he said quietly. His voice felt unsteady, as if the weight of his own self-awareness had suddenly become too much to bear. Olivia nodded, her eyes never leaving his. We are. But the thing is, Richard, you don't have to figure everything out on your own. Not anymore. I think it's time we both stop pretending like we have to carry our burdens in silence. Her words struck him deeper than he expected. The burden of isolation, the years of fighting alone, it had become so familiar to him, so comfortable, that he had almost forgotten there was another way to live. Her presence, her willingness to share her own struggles, made him question his own hardened views about people, about life. They sat together for a while longer, and this time, when Olivia reached into her bag, it wasn't just to give him a coffee or food. She handed him something wrapped in a crinkled piece of paper. A letter. Richard looked at it, confused, before meeting her eyes. "What's this?" he asked, his voice low. "It's for you," Olivia said simply. "It's your letter, the one you've been meaning to send." Richard stared at it, unsure of what to do. She had spoken about it before, but he hadn't taken it seriously. Sending a letter had seemed so trivial, so pointless. But now, as he held it in his hands, it felt like the first real step towards something. He wasn't sure what it meant, what Olivia expected of him, or what he was even expecting from himself. But somehow, he knew that this wasn't just about a letter. It was about taking that first step toward confronting everything he had buried deep inside. All the regrets, the guilt, the shame. It was time to release it. Maybe not all at once, but one word at a time. "I'm not sure I can," he muttered, his voice thick. "I haven't written in years. I don't even know what to say." Olivia placed her hand gently on his arm. "It's okay. You don't have to know what to say. Just write what you feel. Start with one word at a time." Richard looked at her, trying to make sense of the emotions that surged through him. The world outside continued on, oblivious to his internal battle. But in this small, quiet space, with Olivia beside him, it felt like everything was possible again. He slowly unwrapped the letter, his fingers trembling. He didn't know what would come of it. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. As the weeks went by, Richard began to write. At first, the words came slowly, awkwardly. He couldn't bring himself to express everything at once, but he started small. Each day, he wrote one more sentence, one more truth he had buried beneath years of bitterness. His letters were raw, filled with emotion, and at times, they didn't make sense. But with each word, something inside him started to shift. He began sending them short, messy notes to people he had once known, to clients, to friends he had abandoned in the wake of his downfall. Most of them didn't respond, and yet, with each letter he sent, he felt a little lighter, a little less like the man who had lost everything, and a little more like someone who could find his way back. One morning, after he had written his latest letter, Olivia came to see him again. This time, there was a change in her demeanor, a quiet excitement she couldn't hide. "I have something for you," she said, handing him an envelope. "I think it's time you open it." Richard took it, his fingers brushing against the paper. He didn't know what was inside, but as he opened it, a name leapt off the page. Someone he hadn't thought about in years. John Spencer. John Spencer. The name had once been synonymous with trust, with success. He had been one of Richard's closest friends back in the day, someone he had mentored, someone who had been by his side when the business was thriving. And yet, when everything had fallen apart, John had disappeared. He had been searching for Richard too. Richard looked up at Olivia, his heart pounding. "How did you—" "John reached out to me," Olivia said softly, her eyes filled with understanding. He's been looking for you. He wants to meet. Richard's mind raced. John Spencer, the man who had been like a brother to him, a man who had once believed in him, who had stood by him even when others had turned away. He had no idea why John had stayed hidden for so long. But now, Richard realized this was the beginning of something bigger, the beginning of reconciliation. As he sat there with the letter in his hands, Richard felt a shift deep within him. This wasn't just about starting over. It was about rediscovering the parts of himself he had thought he had lost forever. Olivia had given him the push he needed, not by telling him what to do, but by showing him what it meant to believe in someone, what it meant to be seen. And for the first time in years, Richard felt ready to face what came next. The meeting with John Spencer was set for a Wednesday afternoon, and as the day drew closer, Richard found himself both anxious and strangely hopeful. It had been years since he had seen John, since his life had taken its downward spiral, and the thought of facing him filled him with conflicting emotions. Would John still see him as the man he had been? The ambitious, driven businessman who once commanded respect? Or would Richard, in all his brokenness, be just another ghost from the past? When the day finally arrived, Richard stood outside the small cafe they had agreed to meet at, his fingers absently tugging at the collar of his jacket. The street bustled with activity, but he felt as though the world had slowed to a crawl. He tried to steady his breathing, but there was a nervousness deep in his chest he couldn't shake. He had never been good at confronting the past. It was easier to run from it, to bury it beneath layers of pride and anger. But John had reached out to him, and for the first time in years, Richard had decided to take a step forward, to face the past instead of fleeing from it. When he saw John approach, his heart skipped a beat. John hadn't changed much, still wearing the same confident stride, the same easy smile that made him so likable. But there was something in his eyes, an understanding, a compassion, that made Richard feel both exposed and comforted. "Richard," John greeted him, his voice warm but cautious. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Richard swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't think I'd see you either." His voice came out more hoarse than he intended, but he quickly cleared his throat. "Thanks for reaching out." John nodded, his expression softening. "I've been looking for you for a while now. After everything went down, I tried to find you, but you just disappeared." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. The sincerity in John's voice hit him harder than he expected. "I wasn't okay," he admitted, the weight of those words making the air around him feel heavier. "I'm still not sure I am." John studied him for a long moment, his gaze not judgmental, but full of empathy. "I know things fell apart for you, man, but I also know that you didn't give up on us, on the company overnight. There were reasons. You were chasing something big, but somewhere along the way, you lost yourself." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "I was chasing. I don't know what I was chasing," he said bitterly. "I thought success, wealth would make me happy. I thought it would give me everything I ever wanted. But it was a lie. And when it all came crashing down, I didn't know who I was anymore." John's expression softened further, and he placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "You're still here, Richard. You're still breathing. And I'm here too. I never gave up on you." For a long moment, Richard couldn't find the words to respond. His emotions were a tangled mess, but there was something about John's presence, his unwavering belief in him, that made Richard feel like he wasn't beyond redemption. He had spent so long wallowing in guilt, in the shame of his failure, that he hadn't realized there were still people who cared, people who believed in him. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Richard said finally, his voice low. John shook his head. "Forgiveness isn't for me, Richard. It's for you." He looked around, then gestured to a nearby table. "Let's sit down. You don't have to do this alone. You never did." They sat together at a small corner table, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the space around them. As they talked, the conversation shifted from awkward small talk to something deeper, more personal. John shared the changes in his life since Richard's fall from grace, the ways he had tried to move forward despite the setbacks in his own career. He had started his own company, learned hard lessons, and now, more than ever, He understood what it meant to rebuild. Richard listened, amazed by how far John had come in such a short time. It wasn't the success he was surprised by. It was the humility. John had learned from his mistakes, just as Richard had learned from his, though it had taken years for them to both arrive at this point. The world hadn't always been kind to them, but neither had it broken them. "You know," John said with a chuckle, "when you disappeared, I thought maybe you'd just moved on. Maybe you'd found something new, a fresh start somewhere else." Richard shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I didn't know what to do with myself. I lost everything, the company, my wife, my place in the world. I thought I was done." John looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something important. "Maybe that's true," he said quietly. "Maybe you were done, but you're still here, aren't you? And that means there's still a chance. For you. For both of us." Richard looked at him, the weight of John's words settling over him like a blanket. For the first time in years, he felt the fog of uncertainty begin to lift. He wasn't just talking about his business or his career. He was talking about his life. He had spent so much of it fighting, clinging to the idea of success, that he hadn't considered what it meant to truly live, to find peace with himself. "Do you think I can ever get it back?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I can ever rebuild what I had?" John didn't answer immediately, but when he did, it wasn't with empty optimism. It was with quiet conviction. "I don't know, but I think you can build something new, something better. You can't go back to what you had, but you can make something different, something that works for you." The words felt like a balm to Richard's soul. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the pressure to be something he wasn't. He didn't have to chase the impossible dream of a perfect life. Maybe it wasn't about returning to who he used to be. Maybe it was about learning to live with who he was now. As the conversation continued, Richard felt the stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Hope that he wasn't beyond saving. Hope that, no matter how much he had lost, there was still a path forward. As they parted ways later that afternoon, Richard found himself standing a little taller, walking a little lighter. John's faith in him had given him a gift, an opportunity to try again, not for anyone else, but for himself. The weight of the past still hung heavy, but it no longer defined him. He could rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could try. The weeks following Richard's reunion with John Spencer marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. As much as he had hoped for a quick fix or a swift return to his old life, the reality was more complicated. Redemption wasn't something that could be handed to him on a silver platter. It required hard work, humility, and, perhaps most importantly, a willingness to change, to leave behind the broken man he had been and start over piece by piece. John became a regular presence in Richard's life again. The two men met often, not just for business, but to talk about the things that mattered, about what they had lost and what they hoped to regain. John didn't just talk about business strategies or financial recovery. He spoke about life, about choices, mistakes, and growth. Richard had always seen John as a business partner, but now he saw him as something more, a guide, a friend, and a symbol of what was possible even after everything had fallen apart. One afternoon, after one of their meetings, John took Richard to the old office building, the one that had once been the heart of Richard's business empire. The building still stood, its tall glass windows reflecting the fading sunlight, but it was empty now, abandoned, a silent testament to the company that had once flourished there. Richard stood in front of it for a long time, his mind wandering back to the early days when he had walked through these halls full of ambition, power, and purpose. "I never thought I'd see it like this," Richard muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," John replied softly. "But sometimes a fresh start means tearing everything down, even the things that were once important. You've been holding on to this place like it's your last connection to your old life. But it's not. It's just a building." Richard's gaze lingered on the empty windows, the memories of his past echoing in the hollow spaces. "I thought I needed all of this," he said, gesturing to the building and the corporate world he had once known so well. "I thought success and power would make me happy. But now, I don't know what I'm even chasing anymore." John chuckled lightly. "I think that's the point, Richard. You don't need to chase anything. What you need is to figure out who you are now, Without all the things that used to define you, Richard turned to face him, seeing the truth in his words. It wasn't about reclaiming the past. It was about embracing the future on his own terms. I think I'm starting to understand that, Richard admitted. He paused, then added, "It's just hard to let go." John nodded. Letting go is always the hardest part, but it's also the most important. The conversation lingered with Richard long after they left the building. He spent the next few days reflecting on John's words, realizing that he had been clinging to the wrong things for so long. Success, wealth, and power had once been his gods, but they had left him empty. Now it was time to find meaning in something else. During this period of reflection, Olivia continued to be a constant presence in his life, supporting him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Their bond deepened, though it was never rushed. They didn't need to define what they were. There was an unspoken understanding between them. She had shared her own struggles with him, her unfulfilled dreams, her desire to move forward, and the small, quiet moments of joy she found in simple things. Olivia had an innate ability to find beauty in the ordinary, and Richard found himself learning from her perspective, realizing that life wasn't just about achieving big goals, but about cherishing the small, meaningful moments along the way. One evening, as they walked through the park near her apartment, Olivia stopped and looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "You know, Richard, sometimes we get so wrapped up in what we've lost that we forget what we still have." Richard glanced at her, unsure of where the conversation was going. "What do you mean?" Olivia gestured to the trees around them, their leaves beginning to turn orange and gold in the cool autumn air. "You still have time. You still have the ability to rebuild your life. And you still have the chance to make it better than it was before." Her words hit him like a revelation. Time. He had spent so much of it chasing something that had never truly mattered. Now he had the opportunity to use it differently, wisely. And that was something to be grateful for. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Richard slowly began to pick up the pieces of his life, reconnecting with old clients and partners, but with a new approach, one that was grounded in humility and a genuine desire to make things right. He didn't expect instant success. He didn't expect people to welcome him back with open arms. But he knew that he couldn't be the man he once was, not after everything that had happened. His efforts were slow, but they were real. He started volunteering at a local shelter, helping others who had fallen through the cracks, just as he had. He became involved in community outreach programs, using his resources to help those in need. It was a far cry from the boardrooms and financial deals he had once frequented, but it felt meaningful. He was building something, not just for himself, but for others. And in the process, he began to heal. He found peace in these small acts of kindness, in the faces of people who were struggling just as he had. Olivia's support never wavered. She cheered him on, but she also challenged him to be better, to go deeper. It wasn't just about fixing the external world. It was about healing his own heart, finding the man he wanted to be in the quiet spaces of his life. As they spent more time together, Richard realized that he had never truly understood what love and partnership meant until now. It wasn't about what he could gain from someone, but what he could give: his time, his energy, his presence. And in return, Olivia had shown him what it meant to be truly seen, to be loved without expectation, without judgment. One night, after a particularly long day of work and volunteering, Richard sat down with Olivia in her small living room. They were both exhausted, but there was a comfort in the silence between them. "I don't know if I'll ever fully heal," Richard said softly, his gaze fixed on the flickering light of the fireplace. "But I know that I'm better than I was before, and I know that I'm not alone anymore." Olivia smiled, her hand resting lightly on his. "You never were alone, Richard. You just had to find the right people to help you see that." Richard squeezed her hand, a warmth spreading through him. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. He had been broken, lost, and ashamed, but now, piece by piece, he was rebuilding, creating a life worth living, not just for himself, but for the people he cared about. And that, more than anything, gave him hope. After months of rebuilding his life and learning to embrace a slower, more meaningful pace, Richard found himself standing at a crossroads. The urge to return to business, to the world of boardrooms and corporate deals, hadn't faded. It lingered in the back of his mind, like an itch that wouldn't go away. But now he saw it through a different lens. Success, wealth, and power weren't the end goals anymore. They were tools. But tools for what? He had spent years chasing after things that weren't truly fulfilling. Yet in the process, he had gained wisdom, humility, and, most importantly, a deeper understanding of what it meant to live authentically. But could he reconcile this new version of himself with the ambitions that still tugged at him? Could he step back into the business world, knowing that it would never again be about power for power's sake? John had been a steady influence, always reminding Richard that it was okay to want success, as long as it came from a place of integrity. And Olivia, in her quiet way, had helped him see that there was no shame in pursuing his goals, as long as those goals didn't consume him again. But the real test, Richard knew, was whether he could navigate this new phase without falling into the same traps that had nearly destroyed him. He couldn't afford to lose sight of what truly mattered: relationships, compassion, and his own sense of peace. The hunger for success that had once driven him to abandon everything in pursuit of wealth no longer had the same pull. Yet it was still a part of him, something he couldn't entirely erase. He had begun reaching out to some old colleagues, people from the business world who had once looked up to him, admired his skills, and respected his vision. Richard knew it wouldn't be easy to get back into the swing of things. The corporate world had moved on without him, and his absence had left a gap in some of the projects he had once been part of. But the hunger for redemption, for the chance to prove that he could do things differently, was now his driving force. One afternoon, as he sat at a meeting with one of his former partners, a sense of unease crept over him. The corporate language, the sharp suits, the high-stakes deals, all of it felt foreign to him now. At one point during the meeting, his mind began to wander, his thoughts drifting to the shelter where he volunteered, to the people he was helping, to the real impact he was making on the ground. It was a quiet realization that hit him unexpectedly. He didn't want to go back to the man he had been. Not entirely anyway. The meeting ended, and his partner, George, gave him a knowing look. "I can see it, Richard," George said, his voice low and sincere. "You've changed?" Richard hesitated before responding. "I don't think I'm the same man I was before. I can't go back to the way things were." George raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful. "I wasn't suggesting you should, but I can see the shift. It's in your eyes. Your priorities have changed. And that's not a bad thing." Richard nodded, grateful for the understanding. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to do business differently. I don't want it to be just about profit. I want to make a difference this time." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but they also felt right. He had learned that wealth, when used responsibly, could be a force for good. The question was no longer about making more money. It was about using the money he had to leave a lasting impact. With George's encouragement, Richard decided to approach his business ventures with a new vision. He started working on a project that focused on sustainable practices, a business model that integrated environmental responsibility and social impact. It wasn't the most lucrative idea, but it was something he felt passionate about. The project would involve local communities, helping them create sustainable livelihoods while providing education on renewable energy and eco-friendly technologies. The road wasn't smooth. Richard faced skepticism from investors who were more interested in quick returns than long-term change. He had to prove to them, and to himself, that this new path was not only possible but also profitable in its own way. But Richard was determined. The fear of failure, once his constant companion, had faded over time. He had come to understand that failure wasn't something to be feared, it was something to learn from. Through his continued work with the shelter and community programs, Richard also began to repair his fractured relationships with his family. His estranged mother reached out to him one evening after hearing about his volunteer work. The conversation was tentative at first, both of them unsure of what to say after so many years of silence. But Richard didn't hold on to the anger and resentment he once had. He was different now, and he knew it was time to try to heal old wounds. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" his mother said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Richard smiled faintly, remembering the pain of their past. "I've learned that we can't change what's happened, but we can change how we move forward." She paused for a long time, and Richard could hear the tears in her voice when she finally spoke. I'm sorry, Richard. For everything. Richard's throat tightened, but he didn't allow himself to break down. I know, Mom. It's all in the past now. Let's just move forward. The conversation wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step toward healing, a step toward forgiveness. Olivia remained by his side through all of it. She had a quiet strength that helped him stay grounded, reminding him not to lose himself again in the pursuit of success. She never tried to change him. Instead, she supported his journey, offering a steady presence whenever he needed it. One evening, as Richard and Olivia sat on the porch of her apartment, watching the sunset, Richard turned to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, trying to fix things. But I'm realizing that sometimes the best way forward is to just let go. Olivia looked at him, her eyes warm, and trust that the pieces will fall into place. Richard nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. He had spent years fighting against the flow of life, trying to make it bend to his will. But now, he understood that life wasn't something to be controlled. It was something to be experienced. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a peace he had never known before. He wasn't trying to force things. He wasn't trying to be anyone he wasn't. He was simply living, embracing each moment as it came. I think I'm ready for whatever comes next, he said quietly. Olivia smiled, her hand slipping into his. Then we'll face it together. As the months passed, Richard found himself slowly but surely embracing his new life. His work with the Sustainable Business Initiative began to gain traction, attracting a handful of early-stage investors who shared his vision for social and environmental responsibility. It wasn't a massive windfall, not yet, but it was enough to prove that his ideas had merit. And for the first time in years, Richard felt that the work he was doing was making a difference beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. But even with small victories, the weight of his past still lingered, a reminder of what he had lost and what he was still trying to regain. It wasn't easy to let go of the old patterns, the chase for validation and success. And there were days when Richard caught himself drifting back into his old mindset, pushing too hard, expecting too much too quickly. The pressure to succeed was ever present, and he often found himself wondering if he was doing enough or if he was just too afraid to admit that the past could never fully be outrun. One evening, after a long day of meetings and presentations, Richard sat alone in his office, an office much smaller and less imposing than the ones he'd once had in his towering skyscrapers. The walls were bare, save for a few framed pieces of artwork he'd picked up during his travels. He had chosen simplicity over opulence, though the space still felt empty, a reflection of the emptiness he sometimes felt inside. He glanced at the clock, realizing it was well past midnight. He hadn't even noticed the time passing. The office was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rustle of paper. It was in moments like these that Richard was reminded of the solitude he had once so often embraced. Before, solitude had been a refuge, a way to avoid facing the difficult truths about himself. But now it felt different, more like a prison. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. It was a text from Olivia. "How are you doing?" Richard smiled softly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He typed a quick reply, "Busy, but I'm making progress. I think." He hit send and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Progress. That's what he kept telling himself. But what did it really mean? Was he progressing, or was he just moving in circles, avoiding the hardest truths? The truth was, Richard was still struggling to find balance. Despite his commitment to a new path, he still wrestled with moments of doubt. Doubt about his ability to succeed in the way he wanted, doubt about whether his work would truly make an impact, and doubt about whether he had truly changed or if he was just fooling himself into thinking he had. In the days that followed, Richard decided to take a step back and reassess. He needed clarity, and he needed to slow down. He made the decision to take a week off from the business. No meetings, no calls, no corporate distractions. He would spend the time reflecting, recharging, and perhaps most importantly, reconnecting with the people who had stood by him, including Olivia. He called her up one evening. "I'm going to take some time off," he said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and determination. "A week to clear my head. Just focus on the bigger picture." Olivia was quiet for a moment, then responded, That sounds like a good idea. You've been pushing yourself too hard. I know, Richard admitted, staring out the window at the city lights below. I've been so focused on making everything work that I forgot to step back and really see what I'm doing. You're still learning, Olivia said with a soft laugh. It's a process. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Richard smiled at her reassuring words. She had a way of making everything seem simpler, even when it wasn't. But she was right. He didn't have to have everything figured out. The world would keep moving forward, with or without him. The next morning, Richard drove to a small cabin in the mountains that Olivia had recommended, a place to disconnect from the noise and the demands of the world. It wasn't luxurious. In fact, it was rustic with wooden floors, a fireplace, and large windows that looked out over a quiet forest. The silence was almost deafening at first, but soon it became a comfort. For the first time in months, Richard felt the weight of his responsibilities lighten. He spent the first few days hiking, journaling, and reflecting on the choices he had made. He thought about the business, of course, but he also thought about his family, his past, and the person he had once been. Was he truly free from the man he had been before? Would he ever be? By the end of the week, Richard felt a shift inside himself. He realized that, in his quest for redemption, he had been too focused on proving something, both to himself and to the world. He had been so obsessed with making up for his past mistakes that he hadn't allowed himself to simply be, to enjoy the present, to appreciate what he had, and to be grateful for the relationships that had helped him heal. On the final night of his retreat, Richard sat by the fire, reflecting on his journey. The crackle of the firewood, the scent of pine, and the soft wind outside created an atmosphere of stillness that allowed his mind to settle. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about embracing it as part of who he had become. His mistakes, his successes, his heartbreak, they were all part of the tapestry of his life. What mattered now was how he chose to move forward. And that, Richard realized, was something he could control. As he drove back to the city, he called Olivia to let her know how the retreat had gone. "I think I've finally found some clarity," he said, his voice calm and assured. "I'm glad to hear that," Olivia replied. "What's next for you?" Richard paused for a moment, then smiled. "What's next is learning to live with the uncertainty. I don't need all the answers. I just need to keep moving forward, one step at a time." In that moment, Richard knew that his journey was far from over. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, setbacks, and unexpected twists. But he was no longer afraid of the unknown. He had learned that the key to real success wasn't in how much he could accumulate. It was in how much he could give back, how much he could learn, and how deeply he could connect with the world around him. And as he drove back toward the city, toward his work and the life he was building, Richard knew that this time, he wasn't just building an empire. He was building a legacy, one that he could be proud of. Richard returned to his office with a newfound clarity after his retreat. The week in the mountains had given him the space he needed to reflect, but now it was time to put that clarity into action. His mind buzzed with ideas. He knew he couldn't sit back and let things come to him anymore. He had to take charge of the future, but this time his approach would be different. The first step was something Richard had avoided for years: delegating. In the past, he prided himself on controlling every detail, overseeing every aspect of his businesses. But now, he understood that true leadership wasn't about being in charge. It was about empowering others to shine. He needed a team that would believe in his vision as much as he did. But more importantly, he needed a team that could help him refine that vision, making it more impactful. He called together a meeting with his closest colleagues, George, his old business partner, and a few trusted members of his newly formed team. As they sat around the sleek conference table, Richard noticed the uncertainty in their eyes. He had been absent for months, and they were unsure of what direction the company would take. He didn't blame them for feeling apprehensive. He had been, after all, the man who had once abandoned them for wealth and power. Could they trust him again? Richard stood up slowly, his hands on the back of the chair, facing the room. "I know I've been absent, but I want to be clear about something today. This is not just about business. This is about purpose. We have a chance to do something that matters, something bigger than just making money. We're going to create a company that's driven by social responsibility, sustainability, and community impact. It won't be easy, but it's the only way forward for me. There was a long silence in the room. The tension was palpable. But then George spoke up. "You got our attention, Richard. But how do you plan to do it?" Richard smiled, grateful for George's directness. "One step at a time. We start by focusing on the environmental projects. From there, we'll expand into social initiatives, education programs, job training for underprivileged communities, and renewable energy solutions for people who can't afford them." He paused, looking each person in the eye. "We're not just building a business. We're creating a movement. But we'll need every single one of you on board to make this work." George nodded, exchanging a look with the others. Slowly, the group started to murmur in agreement. There was hesitation, of course. The business world didn't exactly reward altruism. But Richard had learned enough in his time away to understand that doing the right thing was never easy. It was never quick, but it was worth it. "Let's make it happen," George said, breaking the tension. And so, the gears began to turn. Richard threw himself into the planning, a flurry of activity as he sought out partners who shared his vision. He met with local governments, environmental groups, and educational nonprofits. He reached out to investors who were focused on long-term gains rather than short-term profits. And slowly, his dream started to take shape. But even with all the excitement, there were moments when Richard doubted himself. There were moments when the weight of what he was trying to accomplish seemed too much. He was no longer just trying to rebuild a company. He was attempting to change an entire industry, to shift the paradigm from profit-driven motives to a more socially responsible approach. It was late one night, as Richard sat at his desk reviewing potential partnerships, that Olivia stopped by to check in on him. "You're working too hard again," she remarked gently, standing in the doorway of his office. "You're not giving yourself enough space to breathe." Richard rubbed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. "I just want this to work. I need it to work, but I don't know if I can keep up with all the expectations. I'm not just trying to build a business. I'm trying to change the way people think about business." Olivia crossed the room, sitting down across from him. "I know it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. But remember, you're not doing this alone. You've built a team, and you've got people who believe in you. You've already made it this far." He sighed, glancing at the piles of papers on his desk. "I feel like I'm constantly walking a tightrope. I made mistakes before, Olivia. What if I make them again?" "You will," Olivia said with a knowing smile. "And that's okay. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them, about getting back up when you fall." Richard met her gaze, feeling the warmth of her words sink in. She had always known how to make him see things clearly, even when he was caught in his own doubts. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been so focused on trying to avoid failure that I've been forgetting to embrace it as part of the process." The next morning, Richard woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent enough time in the shadow of his past mistakes. It was time to step forward into the unknown. He wasn't sure how things would unfold, but he knew one thing for certain. He had come too far to turn back now. Over the next few weeks, Richard continued to build partnerships, refining his business model and expanding the initiatives that had begun to take root. The company's work in sustainability was growing, and more people were taking notice. It wasn't just about helping communities anymore. It was about creating a ripple effect that would inspire others to take similar steps in their own businesses. But even with all this progress, Richard knew that the real test would come when things started to get difficult. It was inevitable. Business always had its ups and downs, and the path he had chosen was far from easy. Yet, for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was on the right path. He had found his balance, his purpose, and his peace. And with that peace came a new confidence. Richard knew he was no longer the man who had lost everything chasing after wealth. He was someone different now, someone who could face challenges head-on, and perhaps more importantly, someone who understood the importance of the journey, not just the destination. As he prepared for another round of meetings, this time with larger investors who would help expand his vision, Richard found himself thinking back to the beggar on the street, the moment that had changed everything for him. That chance encounter had set him on this path, but it was the choices he made from that moment on that had truly shaped his life. In the face of uncertainty, Richard was learning to trust that his efforts would yield something greater than just financial success. The world had a way of rewarding those who were driven by purpose, and it was this belief that propelled him forward. Months had passed since Richard had committed to rebuilding his life, both professionally and personally. The company was on an upward trajectory, but the road was far from smooth. Each new partnership, every small victory, came with its own set of challenges. Richard had learned to juggle the complexities of his business while still trying to maintain his relationships, though it wasn't always easy. The strain of constant travel, back-to-back meetings, and the endless demands of the company had begun to wear on him. Yet, for the first time in years, Richard felt alive with purpose. He had rebuilt his company with values that matched his newfound goals, and slowly, the impact of his work began to reach beyond the confines of his office. Sustainability initiatives were gaining traction, and Richard found himself invited to speak at conferences, not just as a businessman, but as a thought leader in the realm of corporate responsibility. It felt good to be recognized for something more than just his ability to make money. But despite his professional successes, Richard felt an emptiness creeping in. The deeper he delved into his work, the more he realized that he was still not entirely whole. He had spent so much time focused on proving his worth through his career that he had neglected other aspects of his life, especially his personal connections. His relationship with Olivia, for one, had become strained. Though they remained close, there was an unspoken tension between them. Something was missing, but neither knew how to bridge the gap. It wasn't just Olivia. Richard had come to realize that he had distanced himself from many people who had once been central to his life. George, his former business partner, had remained a steady presence, but Richard knew that their bond was different now. They had both changed. They had both grown, but in ways that made it harder to relate to one another in the same way they once had. One quiet evening, as Richard was reviewing a proposal from a new environmental initiative, his phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. She had asked if they could meet for dinner. Richard had a million things on his plate, but he agreed, knowing that he needed to confront the underlying tension between them. The restaurant was cozy, dimly lit with candlelight and soft jazz playing in the background. They ordered their meals, the conversation starting out with small talk about the weather, his latest business venture, and the plans for the upcoming conference. But Richard could feel the weight of the unsaid things between them. The silence had stretched too long, and the cracks in their relationship were becoming harder to ignore. Olivia put her fork down and met his gaze. "I've been thinking a lot, Richard," she said, her voice low and careful. "We've both changed. I think we both know it." Richard set his glass down slowly, his mind racing. "I know," he replied quietly. "I've been so focused on work, on rebuilding. I haven't made enough time for the people who matter most." She nodded, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "You've always been driven, Richard, but sometimes I feel like you're chasing something that's just out of reach. Maybe it's because you're still trying to prove something to yourself." His heart skipped. It wasn't the first time Olivia had said something like that, but this time it hit differently. There was an undeniable truth in her words that cut to the core. "I don't want to be the same person I was before," Richard said, his voice filled with raw vulnerability. "I've worked so hard to change, to become someone I can be proud of. But sometimes, it feels like no matter how much I achieve, I'm still chasing something I can't grasp." Olivia reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You're chasing the wrong thing," she said softly. "What you've already built, what you've already accomplished, it's enough. You don't need to keep proving yourself. The question is, do you know who you are when all the noise stops?" Richard's eyes fell to their hands, entwined in silence. Her words resonated with him more than he could express. For the first time in a long while, Richard realized that he had been running from something deeper than just his old identity. He had been running from the fear that he would never be enough, not for himself, and not for the people he cared about. As they continued their dinner, the conversation shifted. There was no immediate solution to the gap between them, but the moment felt like a turning point. Olivia's understanding, her patience, and her willingness to confront the truth had opened something within him. He realized that he needed to stop trying to prove his worth. He had to learn to accept himself, flaws, scars, and all. But the following days weren't without their challenges. As Richard reconnected with Olivia and tried to understand how to balance his personal life with his professional ambitions, an unexpected challenge emerged. The company's growth had attracted the attention of a larger competitor, a corporation with far greater resources, one that had a reputation for aggressive acquisitions. Richard had known it was only a matter of time before his business faced such pressure, but it was still a shock when the first offer came through. The competitor offered a massive buyout, enough money to change the trajectory of his life and ensure his financial freedom. But the offer came with a catch. The company would be absorbed into the larger corporation, and his vision of social responsibility would likely be swallowed up by the company's traditional profit-driven mindset. Richard spent sleepless nights turning the offer over in his mind. On one hand, it was an incredible opportunity, one that would allow him to secure his future, ensure the security of his employees, and give him the chance to step away from the constant pressure of running a business. On the other hand, it felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for, the values that had come to define his mission. The decision gnawed at him. Olivia had been supportive, as always, but even she could see the toll it was taking on him. "It's not about the money," she said one evening as they sat on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder. "It's about whether or not you're willing to compromise your principles." Richard closed his eyes, breathing deeply. She was right, of course. The money would never fill the void inside him. The real challenge wasn't about wealth. It was about integrity, about holding on to the vision he had crafted for his life. The decision wasn't just business. It was personal. The next morning, Richard made the call. He turned down the offer. It wasn't easy, and it came with risks, but it was the right choice. He had spent so many years chasing after success, defining himself by the things he could achieve. But now, for the first time in years, he realized that success wasn't just about what he could accumulate. It was about what he was willing to stand for. As Richard stood at the window of his office, overlooking the city skyline, he felt a strange sense of peace. It was a peace he had never truly known before. The hustle of his past, the endless chase for more wealth, more recognition, more success, had all seemed so important at the time. But now, standing at the edge of this chapter in his life, he realized that what he had been searching for wasn't more of anything. It was less pressure, less noise, less fear. Turning away from the window, Richard walked over to his desk, where he picked up a letter. It was from Olivia. She had written it a week ago, after his decision to turn down the buyout offer. At first, he had left it unopened, unsure of what it would say. But now, with everything settled and his thoughts clearer than ever, he opened it. "Richard," the letter began, "I know you've been wrestling with so much, but what I want you to know is that I believe in you, not just because of what you've built, but because of who you've become. You've found something that most people never will: peace with yourself. And I can't tell you how proud I am of you for not letting fear decide your future. I love you, Richard. Always have, always will." Richard placed the letter down slowly, a lump rising in his throat. The words weren't just comforting. They were a reminder of how far he had come. The world he once knew, the man he once was, seemed so distant now. His old self, the one driven by ambition and the need to prove himself, had been replaced by a man who understood the weight of his choices. And those choices had led him to something far more valuable than he ever anticipated. The business was doing well, better than he had expected. After turning down the buyout, Richard had restructured the company in ways that ensured it would thrive without compromising its core values. He had focused more on developing long-term partnerships with like-minded companies and nonprofits, expanding his sustainability initiatives, and building communities around shared goals. Slowly but surely, his company was becoming a leader in socially responsible business practices. But the most rewarding part of his journey hadn't been the growth of the business. It had been the growth of his relationships. Olivia had stayed by his side, supporting him even when he questioned everything. Their relationship was no longer defined by the expectations they once had for each other. They had found a balance, one built on trust and respect. The quiet moments they shared now meant more to him than the loud victories of his past. Richard also reconnected with George, his former business partner. Though their bond had changed, they found new ground to work on together. George had been a key part of the new direction Richard had taken with the company. They may no longer have the same shared vision for wealth accumulation, but they both believed in making a lasting impact. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about legacy. Richard had come to understand that a legacy wasn't something to be chased, it was something to be built. The way he treated people, the way he led his company, the way he shaped his relationships. Those were the things that would define the mark he left on the world. As the months passed, the ripple effect of Richard's decision to stay true to his values began to show. His company inspired other businesses to think beyond profits and consider their impact on the world. He spoke at conferences not just about sustainability, but about the importance of authenticity, compassion, and integrity in leadership. Slowly, he became a mentor to other young entrepreneurs who wanted to build businesses that aligned with their values, just as he had done. But perhaps the most unexpected part of this journey had been the reunion with his old friend, the beggar he had once met on the street. One afternoon, as Richard was leaving a meeting, he spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the park. It was the same man, the one he had once helped, the one whose life had seemed so hopeless. The man looked older now, his face weathered, but his eyes still carried the same quiet wisdom. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he approached. The beggar looked up, recognition flickering across his face. "You," he said with a faint smile, "I knew you'd come back one day." Richard sat beside him on the bench, an overwhelming sense of gratitude and relief filling him. "I didn't know if I would ever see you again," Richard admitted. "But I never stopped thinking about what you said. That moment, when you told me I was running from myself, it changed everything." The beggar nodded slowly. "Sometimes, it takes losing everything to realize what you truly have. But you found your way back. That's the thing, Richard. You were never lost. You just had to understand where the real treasure is." Richard smiled, feeling the weight of the man's words sink deep into his heart. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of fulfillment that didn't come from accomplishments or accolades. It came from understanding that life was about the people we touch, the values we uphold, and the way we treat others. The beggar had seen that truth before Richard did. And now, in some way, they were both free. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the park, Richard realized that he no longer needed to prove anything. He had built his life on a foundation of purpose, and with that, he had everything he needed. He stood up, offering the beggar his hand. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed me what really matters." The beggar took his hand, his grip firm, and nodded. "No, Richard, you showed yourself." And with that, Richard walked away, feeling the weight of the past lift off his shoulders, replaced by the lightness of clarity. He was no longer the man who sought validation through success. He was the man who had found his own truth. As he returned to his office, ready to continue the work he had started, Richard knew that his journey wasn't over. But this time, he wasn't running. He was living, fully present in each step, each decision, and each connection. In the end, he understood that a legacy wasn't something you left behind. It was something you lived every day, in every moment. And Richard was finally living it. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.